I'm Timmy Pierce, Executive Director, and we're delighted to see you here today. And we are very happy with our presenter today. Jerry Trescott just happens to be on our collections committee, and he is working on Shellman Furnishings on Miriam Beck's collection committee. Miriam chairs the committee, and Jerry is sub-chairing the furnishings committee. Miriam, of course, is on our board. Eleanor Darcy is here, who is on our board. Of course, Helen Riley, our program chair, is on our board. And there was somebody else here. Who am I? Matt Candlin, town manager of Sykesville. And what are you doing over there? Diana Scott, who's hiding over there in the corner, is one of our board members who wrote the Oakland Mills book. We have a complimentary piece up here for those of you who are interested in a montage of Westminster. There is a BLT special. You can come take a look at it. And there are copies over at Cocky's if you would like to purchase it. You all know that I always do the commercials. Jerry is an architectural historian. He graduated from the University of Maryland and then received his master's in historical restoration from Middle Tennessee State in Nashville. Right place? South of Nashville. Okay. And he doesn't like country music. I know that about him. How could you avoid that? Or maybe that's why you avoided. Yeah, okay. So did I, and they wondered where I came from. He is going to be talking about our vanished heritage in Westminster, what was and what is no longer here. He is an expert in analysis, design, and restoration of historical structures. And he will talk about the losses to Westminster's architectural history. He also is extremely interested in furnishings, historical furnishings, and Baltimore furnishings in particular. So without further ado, here's Jerry Trescott.
Is my microphone on yet? All right. Timmy, thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction. We're going to be talking today, as Timmy said, about what was in Westminster, what we've lost, and unfortunately we will never see the likes of again because of the times that we live in have changed very much from when these buildings were constructed. And I can't remember a time when I was not interested in historic buildings. My entire life, from the time that I was a small child, I was interested in architecture and the built environment and what was around me. The buildings in all their forms really fascinate me. Even this utilitarian structure, I look at it and think about how it's put together and why it stands and the purposes for why it's here. Now, when we look at any structure, there's always a story to be told about it. It's not just why it's here, it's how it's here, who designed it, how it functions in today's world. The people and the economic conditions that bring a building to life are part of the integral story in all of the structures that we see around us. Now, particularly when you think about Westminster, when walking or driving down Main Street, in the future, I'd like you to look a little beyond the traffic that's around you as you're at a stoplight. I won't say as you're driving down the road. But look up, look at the cornices of the buildings, look at the shape of the windows, look at the materials that you'll find around you. And I think you'll see that we have a much varied city here that we live in and appreciate. Now, the structures always tell the history, particularly of this mid-Maryland town, that dates from the 18th century. And that development of Westminster is expressed through the buildings and the streets and the layout of this town. No structure in this city has national importance historically or architecturally, but when you combine everything that's in this town, you suddenly of the identity of an American society and architecture. And that's what's important to me about Westminster, is the combination of everything that we have here. We have, originally, there were, if you consider from a humble 2.5-story brick townhouse to things like the Albion Hotel, which was the star of the 19th century in Westminster and still is and hopefully will be again as it was built in the 1880s. Now let's think for a minute that it's 1810 and not 2010. At that time, it still would have been possible to stand on the two hills in Westminster, College Hill, and then here in the east, and down through the valley of Westminster. And the important thing to consider when you're thinking about Westminster's architectural history is that there were a number of small communities that came together to form this city. And as you drive up and down the street, there are pockets still dating from the 18th century.
Losing the mic right now.
He's working on it, I think. All right. Now, between these hills, as I said, were scattered different groupings of buildings that came together to form what we know today as Westminster. A few of the buildings, if we were in 1810, we would recognize the form of them. There are a few survivors from that early period that we appreciate, particularly the Shellman House, which is right across the alley here. That survives from 1807, and luckily it's gone through several periods of restoration, and we're now in another period of restoration, bringing the interiors back to what they looked like in the early 19th century. And today we're going to follow Main Street from one end of the town to the other. From the site of Corbett's Charge to Terrace Hill, we're going to look at buildings that have come and gone. Some still survive in an altered form, and we're going to talk about that. And each photo reveals an age which exists only on paper, but hopefully also in our minds. The early street scenes that we see in these photos and I included these two because I wanted you to get a feeling for what Westminster was in the 19th century. And it's from these two photos that you can look and see the hills that I was talking about and how everything came together in the center of town where the Albion and the railroad tracks are now located. This is one of my favorite shots. You can see, and Kathy has provided me with all these neat little tools, where Green Street is and all the fields. Thank you. It's hard for us in the 21st century to look at photos like this and imagine that Westminster once was really a rural community. But I think when you see things like this, you begin to get a feeling for what grounded this city architecturally in the 19th century. Some of the buildings in this photo survive, luckily a great number of them. And let me point to this one, which is the Dallas Mansion on Green Street, the church in Belgrove Square, the original Brethren Church, which burned and was reconstructed in the early 20th century, and a number of the houses on surrounding streets survive also. But look at all the church spires. They're one of the things that I think that are important. Frederick always has and is known as the town of spires, but we had just as many as Frederick. But unfortunately, as Kathy and I were talking about when I was producing this program, all of ours blew down or burned down. So we don't have very many left. Now, Well, the next section is called Streets of Time, because what I've done is put together views of several areas of Main Street that were important areas in the 19th century. And what you have to think about when you have a lineal town is there really was no separation between commercial and residential. One grew into the other. And that's why we've lost so many of the buildings that you'll be seeing today, is that the commercial expansion of Westminster in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which was good for the merchants, good for society here in town, but it took down a lot of the identifying structures that people think of as Westminster. And this is an early view of West Main Street. Montour House survives, and very few of the other buildings in this picture survive. But I think you can get a feeling for, even in I think this picture was taken in the 1860s, you could still get a feeling for how developed this town was early on. Because by the time you get to the Civil War, we're a county seat, we're one of the largest towns in mid-Maryland. Between Baltimore and Frederick, there were more people living in Westminster than there were any other community. It was a major railroad town, it was a town of industry, a town of commerce, and I think you can see that by the buildings that were constructed here. There were quite a few 3- and 4-story buildings in Westminster by the time of the Civil War. This is a postcard, and luckily it's been colored to show you some of the buildings, but I want you to see, this is right where the railroad crosses Main Street in the center of town. And if you look at this photo, I think there are a few buildings you can identify, but most of them have been demolished. And that's the saddest thing about a view like this. And we'll come back to this in West Main a little later. This is East Main at the beginning of the 20th century, and I think you can see that commerce has started to creep up into the residential areas when you see things like this. Storefronts that have been added to previous residential buildings. The Wance building, with all of its details still in place. The Tower of the Albion. And you can just barely see Old Main. Do you think the people of the 19th century were patriotic here in Westminster? We were very lucky that many of the photographs that we're using today were taken during parades, so we have panoramic views of streets. And from those photographs, we can virtually reconstruct what Westminster looked like 100, 125, sometimes even 150 years ago. Look at the building that Mathers is in. And we know that all of this is gone to construct the new building. But this building luckily survives, and there have been many changes down here towards the railroad tracks. Another parade, this time on West Main Street. And the most important thing about this is the symmetry of the streets. When you look at a 19th century town, everything is built on a human scale. They were walking towns. They were obviously towns in which you could easily ride a horse through, stop in the middle of town. Didn't have to worry about a place to park your buggy most of the time in the 19th century as we do today. But the human scale of towns in the 19th century is what made them work so well. Because we don't have 7, 8, 9-story buildings in a town like Westminster, and luckily today we don't either. Even though you see buildings in this shot that range from the early 19th to the late 19th century, look how well everything blends together. And a lot of them, we have a common cornice line. This is all one structure, but still you don't see that much variety in the cornice line. The Albion again, you can always find the Albion because of the tower. And this is looking in the other direction. Corner of the original train station, the spire of St. John's. And what a wonderful building that was in its heyday. The street looks much narrower than it is today. I don't know if it's wider, but I would assume that possibly down this side, we've probably gained a few feet, because there's no way that you could have the traffic that we have today in Westminster with a street this wide. What's interesting to me are the train tracks and the gates. Same view about 35 years later. And look at the differences. The Albion has gone totally commercial. In the previous photo, it still has a domestic appearance. And that's what most 19th century hotels looked like. They wanted people to view them as the home away from home. But by the time you get to the early 20th century, that had gone away. Everything became retail. Look at the difference in the streetscape. All the first floors have been changed. Plate glass windows have been inserted in many of these to show the wares that the merchants were offering. Further up East Main, just a very bucolic view. This was the Democratic Advocate Building, for those of you that remember that, so you can place it. Another church spire, and we'll be featuring that building a little later. And one of the interesting things about 19th century streetscapes is, look at the gutter, all stone lined. Streets are dirt, the sidewalks are brick, but the gutters are stone lined. Little details like that are the interesting things about a 19th century city. The Charles Carroll Hotel and virtually all the other buildings in this photo are gone. This is now the site of PNC Bank. These buildings we'll talk about just a little later, but they disappeared not too long after this photo was taken. And you start to see the mixture of 19th century streetscapes and 20th century streetscapes in this picture. This is one of my favorite views of Westminster in the 19th century. And I think that when you look at this building, that none of us here remember probably, but it was one of the most interesting ones in Westminster, and we will focus on that later in the day. But again, look at the common cornice line, how everything lines up. The materials are alike, but we do have poured concrete at this point. Now, the interesting thing that we need to talk about with Westminster and the business district is the high point, the zenith of Westminster's architecture was from about 1875 to 1914. Most of the elaborate structures of the late 19th century that survive in Westminster today were built in this period. We're in a national building boom after the Civil War. The economy was booming. It wasn't until the 1890s that they experienced their first depression after the Civil War. And things slowed down for a few years in the early 90s, and then again, it was boom time. And the next slides will display that. The first train station that has been moved to New Windsor, rather small structure, frame, beautiful cupola. Look at all the fretwork and the brackets. Replaced by this one in the 1890s. It's a wannabe Richardsonian Romanesque, but didn't quite make it. This, I think, is one of our biggest losses in the Central Business District. This was the First National Bank that sat just east of the train station. built in the panel brick style, which was originated in Boston in the 1850s and 60s. There are very few examples of it across the United States. And this came down, I believe, in the late 50s or early 60s. Replaced by what I call phony colony building in 3A. Offices were there originally. But look at the details on this, and the mixture of details. Stone, brick, multifaceted windows, and the bars, of course, to keep the robbers out. This is the building we just talked about. This is St. John's campus. And virtually none of that survives, but how attractive that was when everything was intact. Think of that as the center of your business district. Not many towns are that lucky. Again, parade photos. The Albion here, which always anchors us in the central business district. But look just to the left of the Albion. The early 19th century buildings that survived. And this is what was Westminster Hardware. And then look at all the low 19th century buildings that surround it. Very familiar building that we still know and appreciate. But again, I included this photo because I want you to look at this early 19th century townhouse and this mid-19th century board and batten Carpenter Gothic structure. What we're seeing is the changes that occurred in a residential district as it becomes commercial. Obviously, this building towered over anything around it. And what was interesting about the design of this building is they had great plans for Westminster when this was designed, because look, there are no windows here, and if you remember the postcard, there were no windows on this side. So they knew that eventually everyone else had to build to match them. And they did. Now, again, we're talking about losses. This building is gone. This was Westminster Hardware before the metal frame that covered it when it burned. First time I saw the complete facade of that is as it was being demolished after the fire, because everything was still intact on the front of that building when they took the metal frame off. And many of these structures are gone or altered. Detailed Westminster Hardware. A lot of these are featured because some of the cars, I love old cars. But look how we used to display everything in Westminster. We'd bring it out to the sidewalk where a walking society could look at it and examine it. Today, we're a driving society. We don't have time to stop and look at what's placed on the sidewalk. This was for a society who still walked up and down the street to shop, to go to their homes, to go down to the railroad station. A little later, you see what happened to Westminster Hardware. The beginning of the changes here. This is probably in the mid-50s, I would guess. And I'm dating that from this automobile, even though that's probably about 1949 or 50. But look at what's happened to Westminster Hardware. We have an Art Deco facade now. We've stuccoed the entire first floor, and all the canopy that shielded the front of the building is gone, and every bit of merchandise is now inside, because it's a driving society, not a walking society. And look at the contrast. And how many buildings in this photo survive? Just do a mental count as you're looking at this photo. Here are the early 19th century structures. This one could be 18th century because of the pitch of the roof. Train station, the building that sat on the corner. of Main Street, and the houses that went down this block, which we also will be concentrating a little more on. This sits where the parking lot does now, on the corner of Main and Liberty. Look at the details, particularly in this small business here. We see large plate glass windows, which were not possible till the third quarter of the